Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson at the State Water Survey, and welcome to what realtors need to know about homes with well water. So this webinar and our monthly webinars through the private well class are hosted by the Illinois State Water Survey at the U of I. And the private well class itself is a program funded through the US EPA to the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, who is our partner. And we've been involved with this program now for 9 years, which is really awesome as far as that goes. Okay. I just turned on my webcam, which I didn't mean to do. All right. So today's webinar, again, is a part of a national program. We do record all of these webinars, and they're available on our YouTube page. The advantage there is, as you all know who are here today, you were given an opportunity to ask questions when you registered. And we'll answer a lot of those questions today at the end, but every month, different people who are on the webinar ask different questions. And so those videos are really useful for learning more about private well issues, just from the standpoint of we try to answer different questions every month, not the same ones. And so you can find answers to questions that might not get answered today in a past video, and that sort of thing. If you have a question today, there will be time. We'll stick around and answer questions as long as you all ask them. There is a question box or a chat box on your GoToWebinar window. If you'll put your question in there, we'll monitor that and make a list of those, and we'll pull them up at the end and go through those. If it's something we can't answer, we may ask that you send us an email so that we can follow up, but we'll find an answer if we can't answer ourselves. And these webinar materials do follow our free course. This is not the private well class lessons. If you are not familiar with that, it's a 10-lesson class. You sign up online, it sends you a PDF once a week for 10 weeks. It's really kind of a well owner 101. Which it's meant to give a well owner the basics of what they need to understand, why it's important, all those sorts of things. And so with that, we do provide continuing education credit for through the National Environmental Health Association and through the Illinois LEHP program, which stands for Licensed Environmental Health Professional. So if you are one of those folks, we have stuff available here on the handouts tab of the GoToWebinar screen that you have. You can download that material. As far as NEHA goes, your credentialing cycle is 2 years long. You can't take the same class only once every credentialing cycle. And so I listed the other dates that are within 2 years. And as an example, if you just started your new cycle on September 1st, then after today, you couldn't participate and get credit for the realtor webinar we're doing until after 9/1/25. If you have any questions, you can email us at info@privatewellclass.org. That's also where you can work with us for forms, ask for a certificate, a copy of the slide deck, all those sorts of things. So our partner is RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership. They're a national nonprofit made up of 6 regional nonprofit organizations that have slightly different names, but they all work together, and they're funded under umbrella through their national office from EPA, USDA, and HUD. They work with small and rural communities, tribal communities, and private well owners in both water, wastewater, and housing. And so if you are involved in any of those issues, you should know who the Great Lakes partner is in your state. Like if you're in Illinois, like I am, it's the Great Lakes Community Action Partnership. It's based in Ohio. But again, the GLCAP has staff, I think 4 or 5 staff just in Illinois, and they have staff in all the states in their region. And so on the private well side, each region has a number of staff that work on their private well program. They've become experts at private well issues. Not only will they put on a workshop if you request it, they can work with you to find speakers. They can help organize events related to private wells. And we also have a well assessment program. It's a free program to a well owner where someone from RCAP will come out and do an assessment of their well. It's fairly comprehensive. In some cases, it could include a private well, a water well test as well that's free, but it's really meant to assess if the well is properly constructed, if there are any vulnerabilities, if there are issues related to where it's placed or land use or type of geology that might be a risk that the well owner should be aware of, all those sorts of things. It's really meant to be a tool that in the end, after it's all completed and filled out, the RCAP staff person would give it back to the well owner, and it's up to them to do anything, but it would have a set of recommendations, and they include standard things like why you should test regularly and all that sort of stuff. So RCAP's a great partner. Our funding actually comes through them in the national office, and yeah, if you want to get in touch with any of those folks, you can look on the side here and write down this information, or you can email us, and we just need to know what state you're in, and I can forward that to the right contact with the right regional group. So we're at the Illinois State Water Survey, and a lot of folks, well, most folks outside of Illinois, and even a lot of folks within Illinois don't know who we are. It's because most states don't have a water survey. Every state has a state geological survey, but Illinois started the State Water Survey, which is a sister agency in 1895 because of cholera and typhoid outbreaks, to look at water quality in Illinois and try to understand some of those problems. Today, it's an organization that's about 100 staff, and we have the state hydrologists, the state climatologists. We do a lot of applied research as well as public service. We house the state's well logs. So if a well owner in Illinois is looking for their well log, they would come to us, and many do. We have a lab that does water quality sampling. And again, I mentioned applied research. We do a lot of work helping communities in Illinois and in the country looking at specific issues like arsenic in groundwater or lead issues and things like that. It's a great place to work, to be honest. And it allows us not only to do the science behind a lot of the work we do, but then also apply that into things like the private well class, where we can answer questions and use the expertise from our staff to help find answers to complicated problems. So as an example, so our records go back to 1895, and recently we uncovered a lot of glass plate slides. And so we've been scanning all those. And just looking at our history, this is a young man in New Athens, Illinois in 1913, helping a water survey scientist take a water sample and do the analysis in the field for their city well. This is a map that's in a Pana data files. Pana, Illinois is a town that in 1916 had a typhoid outbreak. There were 36 cases, I believe. They were concerned it was the water because they had a new treatment system built in 1912, but they didn't run it because the mayor said it cost too much money to run, and only half the town was sewered. And so there were a lot of the waste issues in the community that were unsanitary. It turned out it was a Pana ice cream company where they also sold milk. They had one large vat or container that everyone got their milk out of using the same bucket, and that got contaminated and led to all these cases. So it's really interesting, our history. This is a community well that's there in a park. These were outlawed in around 1930 in Illinois because of the finally understood the sanitary problems of an old hand pump like this. That tin cup laying on the ground, people would walk up, rinse it out, and just take a drink. A lot of bacteria growth in that mechanical device for sure. And the water surveys there taking this picture. You can see the briefcase, if you will, to collect a water sample. So it's a lot of cool stuff. It's we've come a long way there. We've done a lot of work related to wastewater as well. So today, I'm Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist, and I'm going to present today. Katie Buckley's with me. She's part of our private well class program. She's a water resources specialist. She does a lot of the legwork that makes us all look good, as far as she works with all of you for continuing education credit, sets up all the logistics for these webinars, and she'll be your contact afterward if you have questions or send anything to that info at privatewellclass.org email. So first thing we want to do is we want to conduct a poll, and really it's a real simple question about who you are. And if you would answer that, we do look at that stuff when we're considering attendance for the continuing education credit, but it also helps us. We're funded ultimately through US EPA, and they'd like to know if we're actually serving the right audience, some of those things. And so we aggregate all this information over the grant to say, here's how many well owners we've helped, here's how many realtors we've helped, or other professionals who've participated in our program. So we'll give you a minute to do that.
Yep,
And
so
Katie, I'm assuming.
Oh,
go ahead.
Yeah, I've launched the poll, so it is live now. All right, we have 80% in. All right, I will close the poll and share the results.
Yeah, and we typically have a lot of health professionals and regulatory agency folks because of the continuing education credit. So we get that. I think that 15% of our audience are real estate professionals, so small but mighty group, and we appreciate you being here. So anything else, Katie?
Nope, that's it. All right, I've closed the poll.
Thank you. Okay, so today we're going to talk about really the point of having a webinar for realtors is to help them understand the differences, whether they're the buyer or the seller, and what they should understand about wells, especially if they're dealing with homes or selling or buying, helping folks buy or sell homes that have a private well. The more you know, the better you come off with your client, all those sorts of things. And there's really some water basics that if you're dealing with homes with private wells, you should really understand. And I'll say first off that if you haven't taken the private well class, the 10 lesson class that you sign up for on our website, which I'll describe a little more later, you really should. It's worth going through. I mean, it's self-paced, it's free. There's really, it's really a lot of good information to help understand what risks are from different well types, all that sort of stuff. So we're going to talk about well construction basics today, as well as some basic water quality information. And then at the end, we'll go through some of the questions you all asked in advance. And then at the very end, I'll pull up a Google Doc that Katie's going to add to during the day with questions that you all have asked in the question or chat box on your GoToWebinar screen. So if something comes up today or your question doesn't get answered, you can ask it again and we'll try to get to it. Again, we'll stick around as long as you will. Idea here is to provide support to you all in your dealings with private well owners throughout the country. So the things to remember about private wells, how they're different really than community water supplies and homes on those. They're not regulated. It's really up to the owner and user to be sure the water's safe. So they are the water operator, if you will. And so all of that responsibility falls on the homeowner. And it's not a dramatic responsibility, but it needs to be an informed responsibility. The more you understand your well and those things, the way I like to couch this is that by going through our class especially, you learn enough about wells and how water gets into wells and how wells can be contaminated and some of those things that whenever you do have a problem, you can ask better questions. And when a well owner comes to you as a professional, a realtor, whatever, and has those questions, to be able to answer that or know who the resources are that you can get to answer that question, that's the key to all this, right? It's I won't have every answer to the questions we have today, but I don't know how to find the answers, and that's really what everyone should strive to do. So one of the biggest things to remember is I hear all the time, you know, my well water tastes great. It's better than city water. We were just at the state fair in Illinois, talked to hundreds of families, and with private wells, and I bet I heard that 50 times. My well water tastes great. I don't like city water. You know, it's got a chlorine taste, whatever. You can't go by taste. You need to test. It can look, smell, it can have no taste, no odor or color, and still be a problem. And a good example of that is arsenic. Arsenic is a common contaminant around the country. There's at least 1 or 2 aquifers in most states that have high arsenic. It doesn't taste, it has no color, and it has no smell. It looks just like, you know, good clean water. The only way to know for sure is to sample. And I grew up on an old dug well that was not safe to drink, but I got used to it as I grew up. But today I live on a community water supply. I pay $50 to $70 a month for my water. That's partly because I have a teenage daughter. But that's the cost that it is spread out over the 150,000 residents we have to sample the water to make sure it's safe, to maintain all the infrastructure and treatment equipment so that the water they're delivering meets all the health standards and all the requirements under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And that's the responsibility of a well owner if you are a well owner. And then, you know, there's another $20 to $30 a month for our sewer. And that gets to your septic or on-site wastewater treatment system. And, you know, I bring that up because if you are going to have a private well, you need to test. You need to be sure you're maintaining things or and understanding what might fail. You know, pumps don't last forever. Treatment equipment has to be maintained. If you have a softener or whatever you might have, and not doing those things can cause problems. The first thing I want to talk about is your client may not understand, and this is kind of an understatement. Many don't understand what it means to own a well. We had a professor here at the U of I in finance who had lived in New York City and always lived in the city his whole life. They moved here. This is a fairly rural area. There's about 180,000 residents in the urban part of our county, and the rest is mostly farmland. They bought a house out in the country, a little colonial house, and he was 3 months in when he had a water problem and contacted us and knew nothing about his well, had never even worried about it, just assumed it would always work, and you know, did no advance looking at the issues that might come with being a well owner. So not knowing if it's well properly constructed or what the water quality is. If you're like, again, if you're the seller, those things can reduce the value of your home. And, you know, especially the poor water quality is something that can be dealt with. So what we would recommend is that you sample before you put it on the market, find out if there's any water quality problems. If there are, you might want to add or do the repairs up front so that when you do sell the property, you've got that information available for the folks who are interested in your home. It shows you're being proactive. It shows that you're providing water that's safe to drink. And, you know, there's a lot of treatment equipment out there. And not having any, because I've drank this my whole life. As I said, I grew up on an old dug well. It was in a ravine in our cattle pasture. So my dad, it was a well my grandpa hand dug in 1933. I grew up on it, and I got used to it. But it was really always contaminated. It was always had bacteria in it. When I left for college and then came back 3 months later for Christmas, the water made me sick. And that's because I'd been drinking different water for 3 months, chlorinated water, and I lost all that bacteria that had been in my stomach and that I'd been used to. And so that's a real thing. And when someone says, well, I've been drinking this, it doesn't make me sick, doesn't mean it will, but somebody outside of your home coming into that property and taking and drinking that water, it could very well make them sick if the water's not safe. And again, the only way to know is to test. And if you're the buyer, you know, it's really buyer beware. It's not only about your health protection and property value, but you have to be able to maintain it. You have to understand if there's a contamination risk. If there is treatment to be added, there could be costs, not only upfront costs for the treatment equipment, but also maintenance costs for, you know, replacing filters or other kinds of things. And you're taking on a responsibility And so the buyer should be aware of that before they take on that property. And so, again, take our class. It'll help you understand some of those issues and things you can do in advance to protect your client from those things. There are a few states like New Jersey that have a private well testing act. They were the first state to do this, and they require testing at property transfer. This was done nearly 20 years ago, and they have about 13,000 of these property transfers a year in New Jersey. And so they collect 13,000 samples a year on average. Because of that, they have this enormous database of water quality data for the state of New Jersey. They know where there's naturally occurring arsenic or other kinds of natural contaminants. The law is really written to protect everybody. It's required that you test, and they have a list of labs that you can use, and the results go to the buyer and the seller only. The rest of the public don't get to see those results. What we get to see is all the online tools they've developed showing they spread out, like they show a 2-mile grid of water quality values. So if there's an area that's higher in arsenic, that 2-mile square is going to show up more red than an area that's lower in arsenic. So it gives anyone an idea that there might be arsenic in that area, but at the same time is protecting the individual property. And the buyer and the seller have to figure that out for themselves, who's going to pay for it. When this first started, it was about $600. I don't know what it is today, to be honest. But what I do know is, a lot of people complained and realtors complained that this was going to ruin the market and all that sort of thing. None of that happened. And so it's just another part of due diligence, if you will, and ensuring that folks know what they're getting into when they buy a property. So it's actually turned out to be a really good law for them. There was a call a number of years ago to try to do this nationally. That kind of fell flat. There's a number of states like Illinois, farm states, where land rights are a much bigger issue that it would probably never pass here to have that done. So there's an FAQ that goes along with that. I won't go into that, but it's really meant to protect folks who are buying property so they know what's going on. Now, Oregon also does this, and so does Rhode Island, and I believe Connecticut. And Rhode Island's law is a little different. It's newer. And so it also requires testing at property sale. But my understanding of the law is that if there's a problem, if something doesn't meet a health standard. So to be clear, private wells aren't regulated for water quality once they're installed. So if I buy a well in a home in Illinois with a well, it's up to me to test it. If it doesn't meet a health standard, like for arsenic, and I run into people all the time who think I've drank this all my whole life, I'm not worried about it. That's your choice. You don't have to treat it. You don't have to do anything. But in Rhode Island, the way the law is written is if they find a contaminant that's above a health standard for a community water supply through the Safe Drinking Water Act, they're applying that to the private well, and it has to be remediated. And I don't know if they've actually done this or if it's been tested as far as how legal that is, but my understanding is they've tied it to their home inspectors program, and a home inspector has the authority to condemn a property if the water isn't safe to drink. And so you can look into that if you're in the area or you deal with properties in Rhode Island. You probably already know that rule better than I do. But it's the most stringent law in the country related to that. And again, I think there's only 4 states that actually require testing at property sale. So in every other state, there are no requirements for testing from the state or a health agency. There are some other areas where there are local requirements. This is a county, Westchester County in New York. They've developed their own private testing law. I know there's, I think, 2 counties in Pennsylvania that have done the same thing. And in Massachusetts and Connecticut, they're made up of local health districts, their home rule states. And every one of those health districts has the authority to pass whatever laws they choose. and a few actually even have the ability to condemn wells, which, it's one of the few places in the country. There's a health district in Connecticut where they have the authority to condemn a well if it's contaminated. That authority doesn't exist almost anywhere else. So, but the problem is some of those local health districts have those laws and have created that sort of thing. Others have no laws and no rules. And so you can actually go from a home on one side of the street where there's requirements for testing or whatever to the other side of the street, and you have no rules whatsoever. And so that kind of local difference really is difficult for a homeowner or even just a common citizen. It should be more standardized in my book. And yeah, there's just very different local requirements. I know Massachusetts is looking at trying to change that and set a minimum standard for some of the water quality based issues related to private wells, which we certainly support. So again, whether you represent the buyer or the seller, you should do an inspection of the well and water system before a sale. It should be tested, and you should inform your client, and they should be informed before they make any of those decisions. We have people who tell us, well, I was looking at this property, but it has a private well, so I decided, we wanted to stay away from that. And I always ask them, well, why? A lot of times well water is perfectly fine and safe. You just have to test, and then but you shouldn't assume either way that it's good or it's bad. So a little bit about well types. There are really three types of wells. The first type is a bored or dug well. These are large diameter wells, 3 foot or more in diameter, that are shallow typically. They're either brick lined if they're old hand dug wells like the one I grew up on, or they're cased with concrete tile, or these days sometimes they use Teflon pipe and they cut slats in it. But the idea here is you have a large diameter, like a 3 foot or more diameter well, because there's not much water available. It's usually coming from the water table. There's no real aquifer that you can pump from. And so water slowly seeps in from near the surface. And that's where the problem comes in all honesty. Water seeps in from the water table, or there may be a very thin, few inch thick sand seam that you hit where all the water is seeping into the well from there. But typically they're very shallow, and so they get surface infiltration, and that's where risks are. And I find this ironic. I'm a Midwesterner. I grew up on a farm, and they're putting this well, and I don't know what's going to happen to this field, but this looks like a bean field. That looks like bean stubble, soybeans, and they're putting a well right out in a bean field. This is a boring machine to put in a 3 foot. That boring machine is putting in a 3 foot 6 inch hole, which they'll put 3 foot tile inside. And when I say that, so if you think about the concrete tile that runs under a road, it's the concrete circles that are 4 foot long. You put those vertically and put them in a well, and where those seams connect together, it's not watertight and water can seep in there. And I'll show you more of an example of that here in a second. So there's dug and bore wells can look a lot different. The one on the top is an old hand dug well, and it's covered with 2x10s and pieces of tin with concrete blocks holding it down. But this is also in a cattle pasture. That's why it's so muddy right by the well there on the right side. And those posts look so worn because those are perfect scratching posts for cattle. And so those cows come up there to scratch, and they also do their business there. And that's right next to the well. It's seeping into the ground and eventually making its way likely into the well. So very unsafe. Other things like, snakes, mice, insects can all get in the well. We see all the time, a lot of the questions we get about old hand dug wells tend to be related to something that's fallen in, animals, that sort of thing. The one on the right is a typical bored concrete well. So that's a 3 foot diameter concrete vertical well with a concrete pad on top. Everything's inside as far as the well, pump and those things. And that may go down 30 to 50 feet. And at each 4 foot section, water can seep in. And if it's not around that, outside of that 3-foot concrete tile, if it wasn't cemented, say for the upper 10 feet, that means if that's a foot above ground level, the first seam is at 3 feet below ground level. So any water that seeps into the ground after a rainstorm can eventually get its way into the well. If they apply anything to their yard or there's any animals nearby, any of that stuff is likely to contaminate it. And the one on the bottom left is really like the one on the right, but the wide diameter part doesn't start for 10 feet. And I'll show you what those two look like. So the one on the left here is the one with the concrete pad all the way to the surface. And you can see those little seams that are shown on the left. In this example, which is from Illinois Co-op Extension, but it's from the State Health Department, this is proper construction. They have 6 inches of concrete going down at least 10 feet, so that it takes more than 10 feet of infiltration before it can get to the well. And you can see where the little triangle is in the well on the left. That's where the water level is, actually on both wells. And it shows a sand lens in the middle there, which provides more water. Typically, you can store more water in sand. And so, and then the picture on the right is the one that shows, it looks just like a drilled well. It's got a 6-inch casing sticking up, and at 10 feet, it hits the top of that large diameter part of the well. And the reason you do that is the same. You're protecting, things have to go more than 10 feet through the normal soil in order to get into the well. And so when you find one of these, 30 to 50 feet or less is still pretty shallow. Soil type matters. A lot of things go into how safe this is. And what we find in general, at least from sampling wells throughout the state of Illinois, is that these wells are more likely to have contaminants from the surface than a deeper drilled well that's either sand and gravel or bedrock. And there are exceptions depending on the geology. So sand and gravel well is the other type. And there's 2 types of drilled wells, sand and gravel or bedrock. And in the end, it comes down to how your well's constructed. So a sand and gravel well has a screen like the one that's shown there. And the size of there's a slot in between those. It's one single piece of woven steel wire that's just wound up throughout this 4 or 5 foot of casing or foot of pipe. And the size of the slots between each wire section are based on the size of the sand grains when you're drilling. So a driller will collect samples as they drill a well. When they hit a sand and gravel aquifer, they'll collect samples as the samples come up through the bit or through the annulus, and they'll use the sand size, they'll sieve it to understand how fine the sand might be or how coarse it might be, and that depends then on the size of the screen. As far as, a 10 slot screen is 0.010 inches, for instance. And that's just an example. So whether it's 10 slot or 20 slot or something smaller, really depends on how fine the sand is. The idea is a screen, works just like your window screen. It serves 2 purposes. It keeps the sand out and lets the water in, just like your window screen keeps the bugs out and lets the air in. And so, and that's so you don't pump sand in your well because that's abrasive and can mess up your pipes and pump. And so these are installed at the bottom of the well. The important thing to remember with the sand and gravel well is that at the bottom, there's a screen like this one that's 4 or 5 feet long, and the rest of the pipe going up to the surface is all solid. So the only place that water can get in the well is through the screen. So if you have a 200-foot sand and gravel well, it's solid pipe from 196 up to the surface, and then the bottom, let's say 4 feet, that's a typical screen, is from 196 down to 200. And so that's 196 feet of geology that the water has to infiltrate through to get to be able to get into the well. And so it's fairly protected from the surface. So this is the typical well log in Illinois anyway. on the bottom right, it shows the geology. Here they had brown clay, then gray clay. They hit sand and gravel. They hit 6 feet of it from 120 to 126 and then back into clay. That's not a lot of sand and gravel, so they went on, and then they hit sand at 260, and they were in it until they stopped at 295. And so if you go back up to number 22, they use regular pipe down to 291, and then a stainless steel screen 5 foot from 290, or looks like it's 4 foot, from 291 to 295. And it's all 5-inch diameter. So that tells you a lot. I mean, in this particular well, the water's coming from the sand and gravel. And so the number 23 on the right side there talks about the water level. So they measured the water level in the well when it wasn't pumping. It was at 159 feet. And then when they pumped it at 20 gallons a minute, it doesn't say how long. Typically it's an hour or 2 hours. It only dropped to 165. So it only had 6 feet of drawdown pumping 20 gallons a minute. And a home without livestock isn't going to use more. It's going to be less than 5 gallons a minute. And they probably put a 5 gallon per minute or smaller pump in the well in the end. You typically, a driller will use a larger pump and pump it to make sure there's going to be plenty of water whenever they put in the actual final pump. So yeah, these are really helpful. The estimated yield the driller put on number 3 on the left side is 40 gallons a minute. They did put in, looks like they put in a 15 gallon per minute pump. I just realized that, which is bigger than most. So maybe they did have livestock because a home won't require that kind of water availability. And this was also along with the record. And this is something they provided when the drilling company, Kickapoo Drilling Company, submitted the log. They provided this as well. And this is their own software so that they can track what they're doing. So, yeah. The other type of well is a bedrock well. And the reason bedrock wells are different is because when you think about sand and gravel, water's just in the sand and gravel. If I had a jar of sand and it was, well, if I just had a jar of sand and I showed it to you, there's about 30% of the volume of that jar that's actually air. So the porosity, which is the airspace between all the grains of sand, is about 30%. So in an aquifer that's full of water, that 30% is all water. So if I have an aquifer that's 100 feet thick and it's fully saturated, if I took all the sand away, I'd still have 30 feet of water, which is a boatload of water. Just, you know, more than, you see a lot of sandy areas, they use irrigation and pump thousands of gallons a minute because they can. So the difference in a bedrock aquifer is you're drilling into bedrock. It's solid rock in most cases. The porosity is near zero in the rock itself. So the water's not coming from the rock, it's really coming from the fractures and fissures in the rock, like this example shows. So the only way to take advantage of those fractures is to have those fractures open to the well. So to do that, you can't have a solid casing blocking those fractures off. You typically put in a bedrock well. If you drill a 200-foot bedrock well, the casing only goes 10 to 20 feet into the rock. So in this example that I'm showing, you can see on the right side of the well, it says 10 to 20 feet of casing into bedrock. Below that, the rock that you've cut through and created a hole in is the casing. And that way, when you hit a fracture, like down at the bottom near the pump, you see those little blue lines, those are fractures in the rock. So it's almost like pipe flow, and it's the only water running into the well is coming through fractures wherever you might hit them. So the amount of water you have can really vary. I work with an irrigator in Kankakee County, Illinois, that he knows where there's major fractures in the geology based on other wells that have been drilled. And if you hit those major fractures, you can pump 1,500 gallons a minute for an irrigation well. But if you miss it and you hit basically solid rock, he's got a well that's almost 400 feet deep and it only pumps 20 gallons a minute because he's missed all the major fractures, where he has another one a half mile away that'll pump 1,500. And so it really matters. Those fractures matter. And why this is different is that if you have, let's say that bedrock is only 30 or 40 feet below land surface, you're only going to have casing 10 to 20 feet into the bedrock. So a 200-foot well is actually open. A bedrock well could be open to receiving water from 50 to 60 feet on down to 200. And we see wells that are 600 feet deep. They only have 20 or 30 feet of casing. And so people are like, well, I've got a really deep well, so it's safe. Well, no, if it's a bedrock well, water could be coming in right where the casing stops. So that could be at like 30 feet. And now most states today require at least 50 feet of casing, which is helpful, but a lot of older wells don't have that much casing. I worked in northern New York with some folks that had some water quality problems. And when I started looking at their logs, bedrock's right at land surface. And we saw casings, we saw 250-foot wells that only had 10 to 15 feet of casing total. And so water could seep in at 15 feet. And that's much more of a risk, especially when the rock comes to the surface. If any of those fractures come to the surface, they're a direct conduit down into the aquifer and into, into these connections between the fractures. And so that means they can be influenced over a larger distance. It means that you could be getting surface water into a bedrock well if it's shallow enough, and they're just not as, water could be coming from further away, and it's not necessarily as local as what it would be with a sand and gravel well. So you need to understand with a bedrock well how much casing they have, how deep it is to bedrock, how much overburden there is, which is the unconsolidated sand, silt, and clay that we have, especially like in glaciated areas in the north. And this is a typical well log from Illinois. Again, this is a camp up in the Chicago area. And if you look on the right side, you can also see how the numbers have changed. This is an older log, so the formations that pass through the geology is 18. We're on a new log, the one I showed you earlier, which is it's 30 years newer. The Illinois Department of Public Health has changed their form, and now there's 24 things to answer. But here we have, what's interesting is right at the top of the bedrock at 187, there's broken limestone. There's 12 feet of sand, but they didn't put the well in there. They decided to put a bedrock well in. And then there's 68 feet of limestone from 189 to 257. So then they hit shale, which shale, you can think of it as cemented clay. Water doesn't go through shale. It's considered an aquitard or an aquiclude. And so there was no reason to go any further. And they probably figured out they had plenty of water. And so the water's coming from this limestone from 189 to 257. So if you look at the casing record, number 15, they use PVC for the first 179 feet, and then they use 20 feet of black steel. And the reason they use steel is because you have to seat the casing into the bedrock, and you put torque on that when you do that. And if PVC can break a lot easier than steel can, and so they use both types of pipe. But then the casing stops at 199. So below 199, it's just an open hole that's been drilled into the bedrock. And that's, again, so they can take advantage of fractures that they might hit. And so when they pumped this one, the static water level was 130. And when they pumped it at 25 gallons a minute for 2 hours, it dropped to 160. And so what that told them is, they decided they put in a 12 gallon per minute pump for this small camp, and it should have less drawdown because you're pumping it less volume or less gallons per minute. And yeah, it's a pretty standard type of well that you'll see for either municipal or small non-community water supply like this, or for a private well. Okay, so well type certainly matters. The geology determines what kind of well you're going to have. most people would not put in a Duggar bored well if there was a good aquifer there. A lot of times those are because there is no quote real aquifer or very old. Like when my grandpa bought our place where I grew up, he put in this old hand dug well. It's only 14 foot deep. There is a sand and gravel aquifer there at 80 or 90 feet, but he didn't know that, and this is in 1933. So it's drilled or driven for a sand and gravel well, or drilled into consolidated rock. Depends on, there's different kinds of bedrock, clearly. Some have more fractures than others. Some rock, like karst, it dissolves quickly from water movement, so that's where you have caves. You know, we're talking about Southern Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, as well as other places in the country where there's karst geology. That's typically unsafe because there's sinkholes from the surface that get in there, and it's a direct conduit. There's nothing to filter the water. There's nothing to stop it from getting right into a depth where a well may be. You know, it's like anything else. If you have oil on your property or whatever, it really just is based on your location. You may have choices. I know where we live here in Champaign County, Illinois, we have 2 different sand and gravel aquifers at different depths, and then you could tap into the bedrock if you wanted to, but there's no reason to go that deep because there's plenty of water that's shallow. And again, it's good to have a well log to know where your water's coming from, how it was constructed, all the things I just showed you, because it tells you so much information about your well and your water. And what we find, and what we're trying to help folks understand, is people don't just call us because they're interested in their well. They call us when they have a problem, either a water quality problem, they're concerned about somebody being sick, or their well's not working, or their pump's not working, or there's something, their water's discolored, whatever it might be. You know, people wait until there's a problem to contact folks about dealing with it. And the point of our program is to help to raise that quote core level of knowledge for well owners, so that they can, again, ask better questions, some things they can answer themselves, or at least understand why, and that sort of thing. So if you run across an old well that's poorly constructed or doesn't meet well code today, really the best thing to do, so one of the problems we have is, so 48 states have well construction code, 2 still do not. And in the 48 that do, they're all based on state rules, so they're very different in some cases. But in all cases, if a well already existed before the code was created or changed, they're grandfathered in. So if next year the Illinois Department of Public Health decides to change the well construction code in some way, not allow a certain type of PVC, for instance, or whatever it might be, all the wells that already exist that do have that issue don't have to change their construction, which makes sense. It'd be impossible to do that. But at the same time, many wells that are still in place today aren't even close to meeting our current code. Some are hand dug, some are in pits, and they're a risk. They're a safety hazard, and they provide an opportunity for shallower surface contamination. And so here's a couple examples. The one on the right, I'll start there. This is in Southern Illinois. Don Kelderman was a man I met at a meeting down there. He was actually there for personal reasons, researching his family history, but he came across this well near where his family had come from, and there's a dead goat in it. So the well wasn't covered in any way. It wasn't in use anymore. The house that had been there had burned down. But it's just an example of what can certainly happen. And the picture on the left is from the Washington State Department of Ecology. They're the state agency in Washington State that regulates well drillers and well construction. And they have a blog, or they did when I downloaded this picture. It was about a woman who, there was a piece of plywood over her well, and that corrugated pipe is her well casing. It's in a little well house, but she stepped on the plywood and it busted. She fell in and it killed her. But there's a lot of problems here. If you look at this well, you can see there's a siphon on the other side, or a funnel on the other side. That's probably to put oil in the pump or in a motor, but it's sitting right next to the well. It's going to drip in. It looks like the gray stuff that's all over the ground around the edges is probably old insulation that's rotted. That was on the sides of the well house. All that stuff's fallen in. You know, there's mice can get in there, insects, like I said. We've certainly looked in many wells and seen floating dead mice. We had someone on one of our webinars ask a question about her dad's well. It was an old dug well, and when they looked inside, it smelled funny, the water did. So they opened up the well, and there were about 40 snakes in the well. All these things sound crazy, but they actually happen a lot more frequently than people realize. And so these kind of wells are the problem. You know, in both of these cases, they're just not fit to use. So understanding those things in advance and making sure that if someone's going to buy a property, that they know all the information they can about their well is pretty critical. So what to do? Bring them up to code, and that'll protect the water quality, make it safer. If it's in a pit, extend the pipe up above land surface, use a pitless adapter, and you know, have that all properly constructed in that respect. If it's a pit, again, you can fill it in with clay grout around it, and then you know, your county or local health district or a local contractor will be able to give you good advice on how to make sure that's the way it should be. And as far as abandoned wells, that's another problem. Because well logs weren't required and permits and those things for wells until at least the 60s, in some states as late as 2000, before they decided to do that. And again, there's 2 states that still don't require it. There's a lot more undocumented old wells out there. For instance, the well I grew up on, there's no well record for it. So it was hand dug in 1933. It certainly makes sense. You know, there was no agency for that at that time. But like wells and pits, an old abandoned well that's not being used is certainly a safety hazard and a potential source of contamination. Sometimes we see people think those are great garbage disposals or a good place to throw things they don't want anymore. We did a well demonstration where we sealed an old abandoned well, and it still had the 3-inch hole in the top of the casing of the concrete pad where a hand pump had been many years before. And when we pulled the lid off, there were 10,000 cigarette butts in that well. It was only 22 foot deep. It was empty. It didn't have any water in it, but it was clear that the person who lived there made that their ashtray. And it was, yeah, it's just amazing what people do. So if you have a property with abandoned well, I would get it properly abandoned. In many states, legally, that's what you're supposed to do. There's not much enforcement because there's really not resources to enforce those kind of things and to go out and find them. But if you find a property that has an old well that's not being used, the best thing is to abandon it. And that means seal it with cement and clay. And most states have a procedure for that. Because if someone gets hurt or falls in, the owner will be liable, whether they have rights to be on the property or not. If somebody trespasses on your property and falls in an old well and it kills them or hurts them in some way, you could still be liable. The owner can still be liable. And similarly, these are examples. The 2 pictures are from the Washington State Department of Ecology again. The one on the top, they're pulling a horse out of an old well. And the one on the bottom, this guy didn't realize there was an abandoned well on his own property, and he's in his backyard, and he fell 45 feet into a well. Luckily, it had some water in it. When they pulled him out, he walked away, which that's extremely lucky. That's all I can say. And these newspaper clippings are all from the 90s. 3 of them are from Illinois, where someone's fallen in or died. The third one is Jessica McClure. Those of you old enough to remember CNN covered this live when she was a little, I think 2 months old, or no, 2 years old, something like that. Oh, 18-month-old, it says right there. It took almost 2 days to pull her out of a well, and now she's a married mother of 3. And so wells are dangerous, and knowing what's on a property that you're buying or selling is certainly important. So whether you represent the buyer or seller, do an inspection of the well and water system. It's good to be prepared if you're the seller. Do all those things before even listing it. Make sure if it needs treatment, it's in place and working, it's been maintained, and if there are any potential issues, so you can be upfront with anyone who's looking at the property. Knowing that someone is taking care of the system is just like you can tell when someone maintains their house and cleans properly and has all the records for their furnace and all those other things. It's no different. If you have all the records for a well, and anytime that someone's come to the system and made repairs or replaced the pump, you should treat it the same way, just like you should for your car, right? You should have all the records for any kind of maintenance that have been done. And if you're the buyer, again, I'm going to say this probably a dozen more times before we're done, it's buyer beware, because there aren't a lot of rules to protect the buyer. And it's about, if you are the buyer, you need to protect yourself, not only from a health standpoint, but if you buy a property and then find out there's some issue with the well or the water that can't be corrected for some reason, which rarely happens. Usually you can treat and fix any kind of issue like that. But, and this is a little off the point, but you also see cases where seasonally, a well may go dry. And if it's the wrong time of the year, you might not know that. The best you can do there is, talk to the owner. Hopefully they are honest. And in some states, the owner has to sign a statement saying that they know of nothing. Like in Illinois, I believe they have to sign a statement saying there's nothing adverse or wrong with the well or the septic. That's legally binding. So if they lied, then they're on the hook if something were to happen. But we do see places where in the summer, in a dry year, some wells go dry, and that's something to ask, especially in a dug well or a bored well, where that could be an issue. So I show this because Wisconsin, this is a really great rule they have. They have this form for property transfer of well and pressure system inspection. So Wisconsin doesn't require you to do a well inspection, but as we've already said today, it's a really good idea. And so what they've done is their Department of Natural Resources is the state agency in Wisconsin that regulates well drillers, private well construction, and community water supplies. So they do everything related to protecting water for people to drink and that sort of thing. So they've created this form, and they're like, if you don't have to do an inspection, but if it says that they're voluntary, but if you do one, you need to use a licensed driller or a licensed contractor that's been licensed by the state of Wisconsin. And this whole form is really meant to evaluate the well against their current well construction code. And so the idea is you can see where there might be deficiencies because the well's older or where it's not taken care of properly or whatever. As you go through this list, even it says comments, pre-1991 driven point pipe depth less than 25 feet. So I did not look this up, but that tells me that either after 1991, you're not allowed to put in a driven point or sand point as they're called, or if you do, they have to be more than 25 feet. I know a lot of states have certainly don't allow sand points anymore, but these are all meant to give you information that, and you're asking a licensed contractor to say at the bottom, based on my personal inspection of the real property, the well and pressure system complies or doesn't comply with the state administrative code. It means it doesn't meet current well construction code. And, just because it doesn't comply, it could be something simple. It doesn't mean that the well isn't safe. For instance, many states have rules that say your well needs to be either 12 inches or 18 inches or 24 inches above land grade. So you may have a well that's only 8 inches above land grade. And if it's an area that's subject to ponding, that's why that rule's there, that's a problem. But if you're on a hill, your well's up on a mounded hill somewhere where everything's running off the other way, in all directions, having a well casing that's only 8 inches above land grade is not a big deal. And so you need to understand why it doesn't comply if it doesn't. But again, this is a great rule and a great approach to how to protect home buyers, as well as, you need to be informed. And so if you are in Wisconsin, or, other folks in other states can use these as well. Obviously, it mentions Wisconsin Administrative Code and some of those things, but it's a way to evaluate the well and understand what risks there might be. So I think it's a really cool tool. You should also look at the well construction code. This is Minnesota's well construction code, and they have required setback distances for all these things. And I show this a lot because it's a really good visual on all the possible things that can affect the well. A lake or stream, you name it, feedlots, a grave, all those things. Here's the bottom half of that. 3 feet from a building. We've seen wells that are in buildings, in the kitchen, in the garage. If you have a submersible pump, you certainly can't do that. We had a gentleman in a county in Illinois who we went to visit his well, and it was under his garage. He had cut off his well and poured a concrete foundation for his garage with a submersible pump in it. And so because, with a pitless adapter, you can cut it off 2 or 3 feet below land surface if you really wanted to. The whole point, though, is to have it above grade. So now when his pump fails, he's going to have to either break his concrete or have a whole new well put in. And so all these things are just meant to be, and every state's got different rules. Like for a septic system, some states it's 75 feet from the well, some states it's 100, and some have, depending on the type of soil, it could be farther. There's, those sorts of things. But it's all things to consider, and it's really useful in that respect. So going back to this, I think that here's where I was supposed to mention whether it complies or doesn't comply. But there's a lot of things on this list. So it's worthwhile to understand. Okay, so whether you represent the buyer or seller, you should test the water. Again, if your water, the owner may say, I don't want to test my water's fine, I've been drinking it for 30 years. We actually had a person here in Champaign County who called us about buying a property in the country. It was an old farmstead with an older gentleman who'd lived there a long time, and he was against them even collecting a water sample. And they ended up walking away from that property, which is a shame. But it can certainly be an issue. So the point is, if you need to add treatment, you can in advance, and you can remedy the situation before you put it on the market. And again, that could even be a selling point to show that as an owner, they're doing their due diligence and they care about their water and all those sorts of things. And from the buyer standpoint, again, it's about protecting yourself from a health standpoint and property value. One thing I recommend is that if you are going to collect a water sample, make sure you test for chlorine when you do the sample. And I'm going to go through a list of things we recommend you sample for and go over that in a minute. But just testing for coliform nitrate is not ensuring the water's safe. That's the reason you test for coliform nitrate, is to ensure that there's no pathway into the well from the surface. There's other things that can be in the well. The reason I say test for chlorine, it means that they know you're going to come out tomorrow to collect a water sample. Maybe they shock their well or put chlorine in their well so that there's any bacteria that day or whatever, it's going to show up. Then it's going to not show any bacteria. Because I know folks especially with old dug wells that typically are always contaminated and always would have come back as a bacteria positive. They may shock their well or chlorinate their system before the water sample so it can pass an inspection, or a bank or lending institution may require it, and that sort of thing. But it doesn't mean that well's safe. The bacteria are likely to come back if it's poorly constructed. And why that's important, I'll give you two examples. In Illinois, again, I mentioned there's a rule that says there's a form you have to fill out, and this is from a few years ago. I'm not a realtor, so I don't know if this has changed, but there was a form that the owner had to fill out saying that they knew of no adverse whatever. And one of the questions was, do you know anything adverse about your well water quality or septic system? And we were doing a study looking at arsenic and the variability of arsenic over small distances in an aquifer in Illinois that's known to have a lot of arsenic. So we were sampling in a rural subdivision where everybody had a well, and I went to one home and asked a gentleman if we could sample for arsenic, and he said, you can sample as long as you do it when I'm not home and you don't send me the results. And this is an area we know has high arsenic, at least in some of the area. And so I finally asked him, and he's like, well, I don't want to know because I'm trying to sell my house. And I want to be able to answer that question as I don't know of anything adverse. And so I don't want you to send me the results. Not the most honorable thing to do, but that was how he was going to deal with it. He didn't want to know. He wanted to be able to be sure that he didn't know. The second example is someone in Illinois who contacted us, very upset. The family with 4 kids, they bought a house. At the time, they tested it for coliform nitrate, and it was fine in both of those things, so they bought it. And a few years later, there was an article in the paper about arsenic, so they sampled their well at a private lab, and they found it at 150 parts per billion, which the standard for community water supply is 10 parts per billion. So they had 15 times the arsenic that's allowed by law for a community water supply. And she called me because I'm in Illinois and was very upset, is the best way to say it, and said, why doesn't the state do more to protect me and my family? Well, the law is not written that way, and there's a lot of, there's not requirements for testing. And so again, it's buyer beware. And it's, I explained to her that, the whole issue with sampling for coliform nitrate isn't comprehensive. And a lot of places allow that because they don't understand that. And so, yeah, it's an important thing, and it can really affect. Having 4 kids who are drinking, if they're drinking it for a while, arsenic's one of those things that's a long-term risk of getting cancer and other things based on years of drinking it. So, yeah. And so what do you test for? It really depends on your situation, how deep it is, whether you have to worry about surface contamination, what kind of geologic formation, are there any known contaminants in the area? I'm going to show you some examples. I would always ask my state and county health department or local health department for advice for sampling. Some counties may have resources as far as you can use this lab or that lab, or here's who we use. If you're concerned about a county or local health district having the authority to condemn your well, which, like I said, 99% of the country, they can't do that. Just ask them what rules they have and what authority they have, because if, you want to also protect your property. So, but they should be able to tell you if there's anything locally, for instance, if you contacted the Tazewell County Health Department in Illinois, they would say the number one concern they have is probably arsenic, because there's a lot of arsenic in the deeper aquifer there, the sand and gravel aquifer, the Mahomet aquifer, in that area. And so that's one thing that they would recommend you definitely test for. So you can also talk to your neighbors, drillers, extension. If you just Google my state well log, water well logs, it's going to give you the agency that maintains your logs. You can talk to your state geological survey or USGS. There's a lot of folks, or if you just say my state water quality data, it'll give you the agency, whether it's, you know, a DEQ or in Illinois, it would be the water survey or our Illinois EPA or IDPH. Somebody can help you and tell you what we know exists in that state related to contaminants. So what ends up happening in states like Illinois is that the lender is the one who has requirements. It's either the bank or the mortgage company. They want to protect their investment. So a lot of times they'll require testing before they'll allow a transaction to occur. And I'm sure you're very aware of that if you're a realtor. As far as natural groundwater quality, the best thing to do is all the things I just mentioned. If you investigate those things, you'll find in a number of states, they actually have maps showing water quality of different things. But if you contact your water resources agency or even the ones that regulate well construction in your state, they're really a good place to start, and they're generally very helpful and want to help you. So there are two kinds of contaminants. There's nuisance contaminants, which are secondary MCLs under the Safe Drinking Water Act as far as community water supplies go, and health-based are the primary drinking water contaminants. So a secondary one, for instance, is iron. It's considered a secondary contaminant because it causes staining issues and things like that. Another might be sulfur, which causes a smell, but it's not a health risk per se, versus you know, things like arsenic or radon or you know, you name it. Again, your local health department can either explain that to you if you ask them, or they can direct you to someone who can. A lot of times you can find information online as well. But knowing what's going on in your area certainly matters. And as a realtor, it's probably a good idea to do some of this, even if you aren't sampling a well, just to know what things that you might want to be considering. And so I'm going to show you some examples. Massachusetts and their DEP, they've done enough sampling that they understand that there's arsenic and uranium in bedrock wells and in the bedrock where a lot of wells are. Uh-oh, why did that? Uh-oh, Katie, I can't believe I did that again. I took off the thing. It's going to auto forward here. So you can type in your address and it'll tell you if you need to sample for either arsenic or uranium. And that's, again, because they've tested enough in the state to know where those things exist. They're naturally occurring. It's not a contaminant from a spill or anything like that. And so, and they've also got resources there on the top of the page. If I go to, this is Rhode Island, and this is one of the most interesting ones because all the little dots are where there used to be orchards. And until the 60s, a lot of orchards used arsenic-based pesticides, enough so that, oh man, I can't believe I did that. Enough so that the soil's contaminated in those areas, and some of that is leached down to groundwater. But the other interesting part is that dark splotch in the middle. It's about a third of the size of the state. That's where there's naturally occurring beryllium. And you know, when you talk about contaminants that you don't hear about very often, until I found this on their website probably 10 years ago, I didn't even know beryllium was a regulated contaminant. I'd never come across it in my 30 years here. It's just not something that's common in groundwater, but it is in this area. It's naturally occurring. And it does have health effects. If you look it up on EPA's website, beryllium has health effects if you drink water that's got too much of it. And so that's this slide is why you ask, because I'd never think of telling anyone to sample for beryllium until I found this. And now I tell people I've never heard of it anywhere else but in Rhode Island. But if you happen to be in Rhode Island, it's probably worth testing. Okay, so the last one I think is this is Wisconsin DNR has this website where it's a mapping tool, and you can tell it up in the corner. I told it arsenic by county. So what it's showing me here is all the private well samples they have. Oh my gosh, this is going to do this the rest of the day. I apologize. I have an auto forward, old slide that I threw in here and didn't realize it. So you can see here from the legend that anything in red means the average water sample is over 20 parts per billion for arsenic. And the health standard, as I mentioned earlier, is 10. So in these 3 counties near Green Bay, there's a fair amount of arsenic in their groundwater. This is great to know if you are going to move to that area or if you are going to buy a house in Wisconsin. Some of the counties are clear. This actual slide is actually pretty old. If you look at this map today online, there aren't any counties that are clear or hollow, if you will. And that's because this tool is only a few years old when I downloaded this and took a screenshot. But it's a great way to understand what's going on. A lot of the state, no issue, but you can look at different constituents, and you're seeing more and more of these types of tools being made available online, which is really a great resource for folks, just to make you aware and consider what you might want to sample for. And I know I use arsenic a lot. I've spent 10 years or so studying arsenic in groundwater, and so it's kind of one of the things that I've got some experience with. Okay, so what we recommend is, again, you sample annually for coliform nitrate. And I want to mention again, that's because coliform bacteria only exist in the near surface. They don't exist in groundwater per se. And nitrate is also very common near the surface because of all the uses we have, septic tanks, fertilizer, all those things. So if you find coliform at all, or nitrate at an elevated level in your well, it likely means that there's a pathway into your well from near the surface, which is bad, because it not only means that those things have gotten your well, but it means other things can. And so those are really inexpensive tests. They're easy to do. They're commonly done. And so the idea is it's worth testing annually for coliform nitrate, because that's how you can verify that your well's properly protected, it's properly sealed, it's got a good well cap, all those things. Other than that, though, it doesn't tell you that there aren't other issues. The first thing listed under the initially and every 3 to 5 years is fluoride. Communities add fluoride to their water. Now I think the standard is 0.6 parts per million maybe, because of the advantages for dental issues. And there's no question that it does provide that benefit. But fluoride occurs naturally in a few areas, and it can be very high. And if it's over a certain value, and I don't want to butcher this, I think it's over 3 or 4, it can also lead to problems, health problems. And so knowing that's why one of the reasons you test for it. You shouldn't have it in a private well, but if it's there, it's just naturally occurring. And if it's high, it could be a health risk. And some of the other things like copper, if you have copper piping, are because if your water happens to be corrosive or aggressive, and you have lead pipes or lead solder and copper pipes or galvanized pipe, which also contains lead, then if it's corrosive, it could leach some of that into your water that you're drinking in your home. And that's not a well problem, that's a home plumbing problem. But we recommend these things as a core, just to understand your water quality, and then also ask for advice on other things like beryllium. That might be a constituent of concern where you happen to live or where you happen to be buying or selling properties or supporting that industry. So whether you represent the buyer or seller, inform your clients and be informed. That means provide them resources. Consider even having a web page, because it really could lead to more business if you're a realtor. Folks who are concerned or don't know much about private wells are going to look to someone who does. And the more you can educate yourself there, the better you'll be. It's worth for you even taking our class and also sending your clients to our class. And that's not me trying to sell anything. Our class is free. It's a public service. I work for the University of Illinois. I'm not with a company. My job is to educate and inform. And so the more you all can help us do that, the better we'll be at raising the level of knowledge of well owners, which hopefully will protect public health for more people. Because that's really what it comes down to, is if you're doing all the right things and you know enough about how to take care of your well and your water, whether it be add treatment if needed or at least testing, then we have fewer people getting sick, and we're doing the right thing. So insist on inspection and sampling, even if it's not required. I've had realtors who said, we'll have 3 offers on this house tomorrow. If we say we want a water sample, they're going to sell it to somebody else. My only response to that is, that's totally up to you. But if you're going to let your client buy a house that you haven't done that, then all of a sudden they have several $1,000s in expenses because they have to treat it when they do test it. That's not going to be a good experience for your client. And I understand it's not a good experience if they don't get the house they want as well. But those are the things that at least they should be informed of and be aware, so they can make a decision they want to make. Because sometimes it really is several $1,000s of equipment and $100 or more a year in maintenance to properly maintain treatment equipment. So again, I think transparency and professionalism will stand out. I'm that sort of person, so maybe I'm naive, but I do think in the long run, doing the right thing will always lead to success. There are web pages available in most states. So here's Connecticut's Department of Public Health, and you should look all that information up. You can make links to it. Same way here, this is Wisconsin DNR and their well construction page. They've got a list of licensed installers and drillers and their well reports, and you name it. Information on basement wells and pits. You could see all the stuff there. This is a realtor in Colorado Springs. I found this a number of years ago. This isn't what their webpage even looks like today. But I use this as an example, and I just have, because they provide a lot of information on wells. And it's got to stand out, is all I can say. And I'm not endorsing any realtor here. I'm just showing this as an example. As I said, again, their webpage doesn't look anything like this now, but it's just an example that I like to use, that if you are a realtor and you want to focus, or you have a business that includes many homes with private wells, it's worth your time to be in the know and what all these things mean and what's going on. So the private well class, that's our program. It's a series of 10 lessons, as I mentioned. You sign up with your email address. It sends you a PDF once a week for 10 weeks. It's self-paced, which means if you don't read it, you're not going to get in trouble. It's up to you. But it's a lot of good information. It walks through from the beginning of the hydrologic cycle and how water gets into the ground and wells, to water quality issues, maintenance issues, treatment issues, what to watch out for, what kind of equipment you need to buy. As far as when I say that, it sounds like I'm trying to sell something again. You should only buy treatment equipment for a home that's been certified by a third-party certifier, like Underwriters Lab, the National Sanitation Foundation, or the Water Quality Association Gold Seal. And because there's a lot of treatment vendors out there that say their equipment does this, and it's usually the cheaper version of treatment equipment, but it may not actually do what it's supposed to do. And so it's things like that are in this lesson. Our website, privatewellclass.org, is where you can see that. It's a resource for well owners. We have a phone line and email address, which is the one we're using today. We get questions almost daily on that from folks around the country. So this is the front page. You just click on Take Our Free Class, and it asks you to sign up. We only ask for an email address, first name, and where you live is a state list. And that's really, again, counting beans for our funder, so that we can show them that, one, we're making progress and that we're helping folks all over the country. This is a national program. We've had over 11,000 people take our class so far. which is great. I mean, it's there's 23 million private wells in the United States in use, and so that's 11,000 sounds wonderful, but when you think about how many folks could be taking the class and learning about their well, we barely scratched the surface. That's only one scratch, actually. It's available in Spanish if you are in an area with native Spanish speakers that have private wells. They can take the whole class in Spanish, including some of the videos we've translated as well. All the figures, everything else, it's all been translated into Spanish. On our resources library page, one of the things you can get to are resources for each of the 10 lessons. So lesson 1 is the science of groundwater, and we've included a list of other folks' resources that are on the same topics that are covered, and the same with lesson 2. So I always highlight the Michigan Flowing Well Handbook. Michigan had enough flowing wells that they passed a law to require those to be capped. They were losing 28 million gallons a day of groundwater to flowing wells that were just flowing away. And so that handbook is really a definitive guide if you're in an area. We have a few areas in Illinois where there are flowing wells. A lot of states have at least some wells that might be flowing based on where they're at on the land surface and the direction the aquifer goes. So it's a really handy reference for that, for instance. But there's one set of these for each of the 10 lessons. We do webinars like today and record them and put them on our YouTube channel. They're also under webinars and events. You can see past webinars. And so Is My Water Safe to Drink is one of the common ones we do. We do that two times a year, I think. And we do one on common questions and one for EHPs, a bunch of different things. And so these are available. And again, at the end, we're going to get to this in a minute, is where we answer all the questions. And those are typically, not every question is different, because sometimes we get so many questions about the same topic, we go ahead and talk about it again, but they're all available there. We've done a few specialty webinars, like this one on lead. We actually invited a professor, Dr. Kelsey Piper, who's at Northeastern University, has done a lot of work looking at lead in homes with private wells. And so we had her provide most of the content for this. And it's so that you're informed as a well owner, or if you're working with well owners, to understand what kind of pipes you have in your home and what those risks might be. Depending on the water chemistry, lead pipes are not a problem if your water is not corrosive. It's only when lead is being leached from water that's aggressive or corrosive that you start seeing it in your water samples and coming out your tap. In a lot of cases, the water may be such that it's not corrosive and it's not leaching any lead at all, but you need to test to understand that and know what kind of pipes you have. There's actually a lead page. If you just go to privatewellclass.org/lead, we've created some resources and linked to a lot of resources from the feds and some other groups on things you can do to reduce lead if you have it in your water. There's a series of, I think 21 now, short videos, 4 to 6 minutes long, on different topics. They're about one thing. This one's about shared wells. What you need to know if you share a well with somebody else. We see a lot of folks who contact us because they're having problems either with a neighbor or because of water pressure or some other issue related to a shared well. There's a lot more to it than people realize. It's certainly not the best situation unless you have an agreement in place written. And yeah, there's just a lot to it. This video, why does my well keep losing pressure? We have another one, it's how does my pressure tank work? One of those two is probably the most popular video we have. It's had over 400,000 hits, and that's what I attribute that to is the fact that a lot of people don't know how to make sure their pressure tank is, if they have an old style, nowadays you have a 1 gallon or 2 gallon pressure tank with a variable speed pump. but a lot of older homes or have traditional pressure tanks aren't set properly so that they're kicking on and off at the right time to have plenty of water pressure. And so this just explains all those kind of details. We have a podcast. It's called Tap Talk. I forgot to put the URL in here. I apologize. It's just drinkingwaterpodcast.org. And you can email us if you want that information. We talk to professionals in all walks of life. Dr. Wolf is with Boston Children's Hospital. He's a pediatrician and deals with special cases where sometimes they deal with well water. Brian Swistock is retired from Pennsylvania Extension. When he was still working, he had probably one of the most robust well owner education programs in the country. And so it's really, we try to bring people on that are doing some either really good work or have some really good ideas or have programs that everyone should know about. And so if you're into podcasts, there's, I think we've done now 36 episodes, maybe 3 years worth, and we'll start another one this fall. As far as partner resources, any professional, whether you're a driller, health professional, or a realtor, we have a newsletter that goes out once a month. You can go to our partner resources page under the resource library and sign up for that. You scroll down this page, you can get to links to all the past newsletters. That's what this looks like. This is one I highlight because I mentioned all the cigarette butts earlier. This is that well. And the gentleman there is with Diedrich Well Construction, who's helping us seal that with bentonite chips, which are clay chips to seal the well. One thing I'll note here is this well was right next to the house, or they built on a porch next to the house. I think it's actually part of the actual original house, because the back side of that, of those bricks, you can see it's flat. It's not circular anymore, and the foundation's starting to push out because of that open hole that was there. So filling that in is going to help out with that too. This is just another one of our newsletters. I wanted to mention that we've held 4 conferences. We bring professionals together to talk about practical issues. This isn't a research conference. It's not a bunch of professors. And so those are all also online. We recorded every one of those presentations. They're on topics that, if you work with well owners, there's a lot of useful things there in topics. We bring in treatment specialists, county health folks who are doing novel programs, either with kids or with their well owners, things like that. We have this brochure. It's a trifold, and this is the old version. It still has the old logo, and it's my bad. But it's Is Your Well Water Safe? We put these together so that like a county health department or a local health department could hand them out to people who come into their offices, like it's sitting on the counter. It really just talks about why you should get your well tested, why there's certain best practices you need to follow, and why it's important to know how your well works. And one way to do that is enrolling in our free class. That yellow circle there isn't on the actual brochure. I put it there to, we made it this way on purpose and left a big blank spot underneath private well class, so that if we gave these to anyone like a health district or whatever, or a lab, they could slap their own logo on there and hand them out. And it's been really successful. We've had 5 printings now. It's also available in Spanish. We've had 5 printings. We've handed out to almost 500 groups now, I think. Over 80,000. Yeah, I think it's 80,000 of those brochures. And so it's a good way to get the message out. We pay for it. We pay for printing them. We ship them to you. All you have to do is put a logo on them, and you can hand them out to well owners. Okay. The goal of our program, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is that well owners need to understand why their well is important, why they need to understand how it works, and how they can help protect themselves from risk. And by even just going through the class and learning some of the basics about groundwater flow and wells and common problems and treatment and some of those things, and why you need to sample. Our goal is, again, to help raise kind of the bottom bar on where well owners are as far as well education, and you all can help with that is the bottom line. So we did receive questions today. I'm going to start going through those, and again, as I mentioned earlier, if you have questions as we have gone through today, please put them in the question or chat box, and we can answer those at the end. And again, we'll stay as long as you stay. So, and I also mentioned before, I think all of our past webinars are available on our YouTube channel. So, and I don't know why I'm not sure where I pulled this slide from. We're going to just skip that about the sulfur issue. Okay. Okay, so the first question we had, if there are ag chemicals or if there are agricultural land around spraying fertilizers, and I copied this, are there rules and regulations to prohibit and test the fertilizers do not seep into ground and well water all around? So there are no rules about spraying near a well per se. There are, those who apply pesticides have to be licensed, they have to take a class. There's certainly best practices on where you should and shouldn't. Some soil types require restricted use pesticides, or if it's certain types of geology, and I don't know what states that all works in, that's in Illinois. But really the thing to understand about anything being applied to the surface, whether it's fertilizer or pesticides or whatever it might be, it's really about how the well's constructed and how deep the well is, the geology, and the aquifer providing the water. So like the example I gave before, if you have a well that's properly constructed and sealed at the surface, it's 200 feet deep and it's a sand and gravel well, and there's 100 feet of clay on top of the aquifer, then there's really little to no chance that anything from the surface is ever going to seep down to the screen and get in the well. So you really have to look at the well construction and where the water's coming from, how deep it is, and the soil properties to understand if that's a risk. And what I will say, since I grew up on a farm, but since I've left the farm in 1982 and came to the U of I, the type of pesticides and the application procedures and the ones that are most persistent aren't used anymore. Some of those things, that industry's come fairly far. It's fairly far more advanced than it used to be. Not to say that it's not still a risk, because it is, but it really depends on those factors, and you need to understand, shallow wells more likely to have contamination just by the very nature that's coming from a shallow source. So if you're in a sandy area with a sand point and it's right next to a field, then that's much more of a risk than a 200-foot well that's in sand and gravel and protected by 100 feet of clay on top of the aquifer. And I said testing is the only way to know for sure, but I probably should not have put that in there, because really, pesticides especially, not necessarily nitrate testing, but pesticide testing is expensive, and I wouldn't recommend anyone test for pesticides unless you have you've looked at those other things and it's still considered a risk. If I'm in Champaign County and I have a Mahomet Aquifer well, it's buried under a lot of till, glacial till, which is mostly clay and silt. There's really no way for a surface contaminant to get down there before being, broken down by the environment. So it's not necessarily, I wouldn't say that you need to test. And I left that. This was supposed to be for another slide. and I apologize. I'm going to talk about HUD in just a minute. So minimum testing, yeah, that's where this was supposed to be. So the question was simply minimum water quality testing. First of all, I just want to mention in my own opinion that doing the minimum many times is not doing the right thing by your client. You need to look at what's going to protect them the best, and some of those things, it's not just trying to get by a regulation or those things. You need to look at it from a different perspective. Somebody's buying a home they're going to live in potentially the rest of their life, maybe have kids there. You need to think about what's best for them, whether the buyer or the seller. And so, yeah, I recommend you keep that in mind. As we discussed earlier, the list I provided for what you should test for in our opinion, but also talk to your state and local health departments. Again, I want to talk about like beryllium. You know, I mentioned that a couple times now. It's a local issue, and so you likely don't need to test for beryllium unless you're in that one location. But most states don't have any testing requirements by a state or the local jurisdiction, and that's a problem in some cases, only because, well, it's not necessarily a problem. It's a problem if you're getting a HUD loan, though, or a USDA loan or a VA loan. And what's happened, because there aren't rules for testing, you have lenders and groups like HUD that fund mortgages. They've developed their own requirements because, again, they're trying to ensure that if they're going to provide funding for a home buyer, that the home is actually worth what they're selling it for, and that they'll be able to get their resources back out of it. So their rules are actually fairly confusing, and I want to talk about that for the realtors that we do have in our group today. What it says in the HUD manual for FHA, VA, and HUD loans, the mortgagee must confirm that the connection is made to a public or community water system whenever feasible and available at a reasonable cost. So the first thing you have to do is you have a property that is near a public water system. Sometimes it could be right across the street. They expect you to connect instead of using a private well. If it's not reasonable, then you can use the existing on-site or private water well, provided they're functioning properly and meet the requirements of the local health department. So the first thing to remember is if you can connect to community water supply, you need to. And second, when an individual water supply system, private well, the mortgagee must ensure that the water quality meets the requirements of the health authority with jurisdiction. That's the local health district or county health department. If there are no local, which 99% of the time there aren't any, or state water quality standards, which again, I don't know of any states that have water quality standards, although you could interpret the Rhode Island law today as being that way, then water quality must meet the standards set by the EPA as presented in the National Primary Drinking Water Regulations. So that's the Safe Drinking Water Act. Those are the rules that a community water supplier has to meet. So City of Champaign, where I get my water from, or from Illinois American Water Company, they have to test every 3 months. They have all these rules. They have to have a licensed operator. They have to do all these things to meet the rules of the Safe Drinking Water Act, including testing initially for 60 to 100 different contaminants. And so what this says is if you're in a state like Illinois where there are no local or state standards for a private well, then you have to meet the EPA standards, which is thousands of dollars of testing, so no one does it. And so you can look up on EPA's website the National Primary Drinking Water Regulations, and you can see many of these things you probably, like the first one especially, you've probably never heard of. Alicor's a pesticide, asbestos there, atrazine's a pesticide. No one tests for all of these things like a community water supply. And what happens with a community water supply is they have to test a number of times, and when they can show it's not in their groundwater or their well or their water system, then they can get a variance and not test for that anymore, so that they're only testing for the things that might be a concern. But initially, you have to test for a boatload of things. You can see the bar on the upper right. This is just the tip of the iceberg for all the samples, different things you have to sample for that are regulated. So no one does that, right? And what's happened is there's a lot of misinformation out there because of that. There's no list that you can use to give your client and say, this is what HUD requires. This particular graph that I'm showing, or table, is from a mortgagee letter from 1994 that's been superseded and is no longer valid. But someone, and it's a mortgagee company in Michigan, took that old letter, made a fancy PDF of this table, and they're passing that out as, and I found this online a number of years ago, may not be there today. They're passing this out as, this is what HUD requires. This is not what HUD requires today. It's not just lead, nitrate, nitrite, coliform and fecal coliform, or E. coli. And so doing so, and we ran into a group that was actually writing support letters for folks trying to buy a home using these results, is wrong. So there's no list, as I mentioned. You have to ask the local jurisdiction, the state jurisdiction, and then you have to follow the EPA requirements, which again, nobody does. No one's going to spend $3,000 on sampling for a lot of contaminants that aren't going to be in a well. And so it's really confusing. And when I talked to one of the regional HUD offices, they gave me a different answer. And I've tried really hard to get through to HUD at the federal level to talk to them about this, because that URL I shared just a second ago down at the bottom here, it's HUD document 4000.1. That it's literally a 1,000-page document on requirements for a home getting a HUD loan. I mean, it's huge. It's amazing. So anyway, I just want to mention all that. If you had to deal with that, that list is certainly not an accurate list, and it's you're not meeting the current law. So moving on, someone asked, so who does water well testing for free? Well, really, I don't really know of any free programs for water testing that are just there and available whenever you want them. There are jurisdictions where, like a local health department or a lab or someone else may provide free water testing for a week, or like Groundwater Awareness Week is the second week of March. I know a couple counties in Illinois that offer free testing for that week. Or maybe they've got a grant, like some of the local health districts or state health departments have got grants from CDC, and then they can test in their jurisdictions, but those are short periods of time. Things like the state of New Mexico have a program because they're trying to get a better picture of all the septic systems or wastewater, on-site wastewater systems in their state. They offer a free water test to anyone that provides them their on-site wastewater information. That's, in New Mexico, you could go about it that way. Iowa has a grants to counties program, which their state legislature funds. Has this fund available for counties to use where they can provide, I think sometimes free, mostly it's a cost share for well testing or well abandonment. And that's really, those are really nice to have. I wish every state had a grants to counties program. But what I want to mention is we also did a webinar in February on financing and funding related to private wells. And so if you go on our YouTube page, you can find that. We actually had USDA come and talk. They have a program to offer low-income folks funding loans, or in some cases grants, for replacing a well or adding treatment, some of those sorts of things. But I also talked about all the other types of programs out there, like some of the soil and water conservation districts have programs for funding, paying for half of a well abandonment, for instance, or there may be, it's really meant to be a way. In that webinar, I talked about things you can do to look and see if there might be something locally available through different kinds of agencies. You got to just do some digging on the web. And sometimes you find a program and sometimes not. I will say that, RCAP does these well assessments I mentioned at the beginning, or they'll go out and work with the well owner individually. It's, an 8 or 10 page form that's meant to look at all aspects of their well, the geology, the well construction, the land use, what they're storing nearby, all that stuff. And then they make recommendations. In some cases, they will do a water sample and it's free to the homeowner. And so that's one way to look at that as well. And they're limited, it's a grant. So they only have so many of those they can do every year. But there's certainly a number of people who benefited from that program. The only other time I know of free sampling is like if there's been a spill or there's a plume of known contaminant that's been identified, where the state might come in and make sure that folks aren't drinking water that's hazardous. I know there's in the Chicago area there was a contaminant plume, and they sampled a bunch of private wells and they found it, and so they put in a public water supply in that area. And I know that's happened in Florida as well, where there's been responsible parties that have had to pay for putting in a water system where first gotten contaminated. But that's not free water testing that you want to ever have to deal with. So as far as someone asked about aquifer information, what are the statistics on aquifers drying up and well water becoming scarce? So the best thing I can tell you there is that there's a lot of effort involved going on about monitoring water levels in aquifers. It's been going on for a long time. The USGS is a national, obviously they're federal government. They have a program where they work with the states, including us. I myself have installed 2 such networks of wells, probably about 60 monitoring wells in parts of the state in our 2 of our major sand and gravel aquifers, so that we can monitor what's going on. This is actually a diagram that's on from our webpage, where until 2014 we were measuring it by hand. That's why the little diamonds are there. And then we added pressure transducer and have telemetry, so that we have it's a phone that's at the site and it sends us the data every hour. And so you can see how much more closely we can monitor what's going on with that particular aquifer based on the data. And I actually helped install this well in 1993. And if you look at the very bottom, you can see that the part that's blue goes to 2008 or so, but you could extend that back to the very beginning when we started that project. And so there's a lot of this type of data available. Looking this up was actually interesting to me because we haven't seen the water levels drop that much. It's interesting it's doing it this year. We had a drought here for 6 weeks in the early part of the growing season, but this aquifer is pretty resilient. And so this is what that looks like on our webpage. I changed the zoom to just be 2019 to 2023. But you can play with that bar at the bottom and make it whatever you want. But there's a lot of this type of information available. The USGS, as I mentioned, has it's called the National Groundwater Monitoring Network. They work with all the states. We all share this data. We provide it to them. They can show it on a national map and provide it. This is what that looks like. And if you just look up National Groundwater Monitoring Network, these are all the, and actually this is all the water quality samples. So there's 4,000 sites here where they have water quality data. If you look on the left, it says water level and water quality, and water quality is checked. If I had water level checked, there'd be 14,000 wells that are where there's data. And I was playing around with this and I just took a screenshot of both and I put the wrong one up here. Because the water quality data here is different than you'd find in a home because it's natural groundwater, but it certainly tells you, you really have to understand a lot of information about these wells before you start using that data. For instance, I looked at Rhode Island to see if there were any samples, and there were a couple wells where there were samples, but they weren't bedrock wells. They were sand and gravel wells. And so they showed beryllium having no detection. And so it's in the bedrock in Rhode Island. And again, you have to really understand what you're looking at with each of these wells and how deep they are and what aquifer it's actually in order to understand the water quality. So, but there's, again, this is 4,000 points, and for water levels, there are 14,000. And if you go to this website, and you can just Google that, National Groundwater Monitoring Network, to see that information. So what are the rules for shallow wells? Example, an old sand point, approximately 20 feet deep. So sand points are installed in sandy areas where there's a shallow aquifer and a water table, typically. Some you can drive into the ground, you know the water table is very shallow, and again, it's usually sandy soil. And that's, the rules, basically, the well construction code vary from state to state, but at least today, many states don't even allow these anymore. In some states, they still do, but they have some rules. I know in Illinois, an individual is allowed to put in their own well in Illinois on their own property, not for anybody else, but it still has to meet Illinois well construction code, and they still have to file a log, or they're supposed to. Some people don't do that, which is, they're breaking the law, basically. But these shallow wells like this are so much more susceptible to contamination. It's sandy at the surface. So for instance, in where I live, we get a 1/4 inch of recharge a year because it's very clayey soil. Over along the Illinois River in Mason and Tazewell County, it's very sandy soil. We see a lot of sand points, and they get 13 inches of recharge a year. And so that's 1/3 of all the rainfall actually infiltrates into the ground. So it's pushing anything at the surface, bacteria, waste, anything that's been applied for fertilizer or pesticides, anything at all is going to make its way into the groundwater. And so these are, if someone has a sand point, for instance, or an old dug well like the ones we looked at earlier, I would steer them away from that and consider installing a new well and maybe making that part of the deal, because it's not necessarily, it's much more risky is the bottom line, and much more likely to get contaminated from the surface. What are the steps a homeowner can do to disinfect the well, and are there home tests to check quality after disinfection? So you should only disinfect your well when it needs it. And I'm assuming this needs to be done, and they're just looking for a cheap way to then sample. But you should sample first and find out if you have a bacteria problem, and that's the only time you should actually shock chlorinate or disinfect. And part of that's because chlorine is a oxidant. It can leach metals from your pipes and your pump and the casing. But if you're going to disinfect your well, we recommend you use this Minnesota guide. It's on our class resources page under lesson 10, you can find this document, and it's really helpful. I didn't provide the whole thing, but it's got tables on how to mix things. It tells you to turn off the power to your pump first when you're opening up the well. It's got pictures. It's actually really well done. And so that's what we recommend as the method to use. We hear people say all the time, I had a guy tell me just to pour a cup of bleach down my well once a month. That's the worst thing you can do. It does not protect your well. It doesn't keep bacteria from getting in your system. All it can do is at that concentration, depending on where that hits, it can leach some metal into your water. And as far as a home test for bacteria, I don't know one that's available, and I'd use a lab. It's a public health concern, and you want to test your pH or your chlorine, as an example, using pool supplies. That's one thing, but if you're looking at people's health, you shouldn't trust a home kit for those things. You just should not. They're not that reliable. They're many times affected by a lot of, they're cheap. I get it. That's what you get what you pay for. So anyway, I'd be glad to discuss this further with you. How do I get calcium out of water? Well, so hardness is made up of calcium and magnesium. That's how it's calculated. And really, the simplest, most straightforward approach would be to add a water softener, and that will take the calcium out. So then that's pretty common practice with private systems. So should a real estate professional seek info on the original well permit, install date, pump size, well depth, all those things, or ask owner for a copy of the well driller and service company's last service report. And should you furnish an owner, contractor, purchaser with contract purchaser with a list of local water testing labs? I think those are all good ideas. I think you should encourage people to test. I think you should encourage them to learn more about the well. And so, as well as you should be informed so that when you take somebody to a property, if you're representing the buyer, and you can talk the talk, if you will, about when's the last time this was serviced, how old's the pump, how deep's the well, what kind of well is it, all those sorts of things. You're not only will make you look good, but you're being an advocate for your client, which is the most important thing. And if it raises questions, all those sorts of things, that's a good thing. And you could talk to a professional. And again, I said, so along with other suggestions that we've made today during the presentation about being prepared and ahead of the game, I think it's really important as a realtor that, the more you know about wells, the more it's going to improve your reputation as time goes on and you deal with this more. So that's my opinion. Okay, so I'm going to pull over the questions real quick. Let me get rid of that. I'm just going to minimize that and pull this over. I'll make it full screen if I can. Oh, it's too big. I have 2 different monitors now, and it's really, I'm learning. It's the bottom line. Okay. So Katie, you can see that okay?
Yep, it looks good.
Thanks. Okay. Talking about EPA, when a job site rainwater runoff enters a neighboring property and flows into a water source, old well no longer used, and flows into a septic system, is there any reason for alarm by the soil contaminated runoff to be a problem in an old well? Well, if an old well is identified that's not being used, in most states, that would require that well be properly sealed. If it's become an issue, then I'm really surprised that someone's not sounding an alarm about why is this old well still there? And really the simple thing to do to solve everybody's problem is to properly abandon it. And if it's a job site, it's a really inexpensive thing depending on where you're at. It could be less than $1,000. And if you're in the right area, you may be able to cost share it with like a soil and water conservation district. But if the old well is getting surface runoff, depending on the well, if it's getting into an aquifer, it could be contaminating it. And in that case, in the end, if a well gets contaminated that is in use and they can prove it came from that, the people at the construction site could be liable. The best thing to do is to help the person seal that well. The thing I don't get here is it says, and flows into a water source, an old well, and flows into a septic system. So although it's flowing into 2 separate things there, or the old well and the septic system are connected, that doesn't quite make sense. For one, they should be fairly separated. So, if you email us, I can get back to you and we can discuss this because I don't quite understand what's going on there. Because I can see, an old dug well or something is in a low spot and it gets filled with, rainwater, so to speak, whether it's from a job site or not, but I don't get how it flows into a septic system. So, yeah, sorry, I don't have a better answer other than the best thing to do is to seal that well. Tips for knowing when to use a shock temporary disinfection to clean a well versus adding continuous disinfection based on lab results. Okay, so one of our other webinars, I go into this in a lot of detail, but the issue is there are a number of reasons why an initial shock chlorination might not be effective. Some of them, what I tell people is you should try it 2 or 3 times before you give up. So if it's connected to a source. So for instance, if it's an old well, an old shallow well, there may be, the geology may be such that there's a very thin sand layer that's maybe a few inches thick, but it runs across the whole property. And if everything else is clay or low yield material or water can move through slowly, all the water's coming through that little section of sand. If that sand also happens to be over where the septic system is or goes underneath a feedlot or where there's livestock, then you'll never get the well clean because it's always going to get recontaminated because the water flowing in is picking up that bacteria from one of those sources. So if you have a shallow source and it's connected to the well, you can shock it 100 times. It might be clean for a week or a few days, and then it's going to be contaminated again. Then you'd want to use continuous disinfection for sure, because you're not going to have a choice. And whether that's chlorine or UV, you can look at those options. But chlorine is less effective when the pH is 8 or higher. So if the water has a high pH, it may just be that chlorine's not very effective. One of the things that people have tried, and I don't know a lot about this, is they'll mix vinegar in as well, white vinegar, and that lowers the pH of the water. That makes the chlorine more effective. So measure the pH, and if it's pretty high, if it's 8 or higher, then, and it doesn't matter how much chlorine you use, it changes to a different form and it's not gonna do its job. Plus adding chlorine raises the pH. So you can try adding vinegar, which is not something I've done. You can look that up though. There's a few states I think that recommend it as far as a method. And so that's one issue. Another is that because wells and water systems, home water systems, like all your pipes in your home, are not chlorinated, like a community water supply has chlorine in their water system, right? And most of them anyway. Over time, bacteria do get into your system. There's no way around it. There's a lot of natural occurring bacteria. Iron and sulfate reducing bacteria can cause that sulfur smell. If it's not sulfur that's from a bedrock source, that sort of thing, but they form biofilms. And those can exist in your well, in your drop pipe coming up to the house, or even in your water lines in your home. And if you have biofilms, then those harbor other bacteria. And when you shock chlorinate the first time, it's not going to get through all of that, but it's going to kill the stuff on top. And so basically it's killing the first layer. And depending on how thick that is, it may take 2 or 3 times to kill all the biofilm, if it can be. And in some cases, it's just too thick. And so those are all the things that you have to think about. Yeah, it's not an exact science. More times than not, you shock chlorinate your well and your water system because you're actually chlorinating every line in your house. It takes one time and it does a good job, but we certainly see and hear of cases where some of these other things have happened. And so, you try a couple times, measure the pH, and that'll give you a little more of a clue on whether that's an issue. And, as far as things like a spring, we see all over the country, people use springs for their water supply. And if they have a spring box, a spring is going to always be contaminated. And if you have a spring instead of a well, you should just add continuous disinfection. We see a lot of UV related to homes with spring boxes and stuff because you're not going to keep it clean. It's just the nature of where the water's coming from. So hopefully that helps. And that's the only questions we have. It's 10 after 3. So yeah, the person who asked the first question, if you'll email us, I can get back to you and we can talk about this a little more. So thank you everyone for your time and thanks for sticking around, and have a great day.